So this session is on boards for parachurch ministries, Christian ministries in particular. And this talk that I'm going to talk about today, I'm calling it rubber stamping cheerleaders. Do you guys know what a rubber stamp is? They don't really use them anymore, but it's a stamp. You dip it in ink, and then you put the same thing on the same piece of paper over and over again. So you would get people who, like, we don't really use this anymore, but you'd have people signing a lot of checks and they'd have their own little signature thing and they just stamp it. And so the idea of a rubber stamp is no matter what comes across your desk, it just gets the rubber stamp. And of course, you all know what cheerleaders are. Cheerleaders are there to support the team, right? So we're going to talk about rubber stamping cheerleaders, which is really positive. Just to hear people that are really going to encourage you. No matter what, they're going to say, yes, go and do it. So we're going to talk about boards for parachurch ministries, sometimes called board of directors or board of trustees. You have these in secular nonprofits, but this is also different than a church board, like an elder board or a deacon board or something like that. But there is a lot of crossover. So there's crossover between a secular nonprofit board and a Christian church. But in specific, I want to talk about parachurch ministry boards, which if you guys are with AIM, that is a very good example of a parachurch ministry, and it has a board. So I wanted to give you some other examples of parachurch ministries so you had an idea of how many of these there are out there. Pregnancy care clinics have boards, Christian colleges, medical ministries like Doctors Without Borders, aviation ministries like New Tribes Missions, Ethnos has a division, and MAF has one, homeless ministries, seminaries, missions agencies like Pioneers or Frontiers, trafficking ministries, pro-family organizations like Focus on the Family, political advocacy organizations like ADF, Alliance Defending Freedom, or homeschool ministries have boards, orphan and widow care, military ministries, camps, youth ministries like Youth for Christ, sports ministries, Fellowship of Christian Athletes, foster kids ministries, Christian news groups, and of course, mime groups. So they all have boards. So why is this important? Why is it important to talk about boards? Well, a healthy board is important because the board is the head and the foundation of the ministry. It's the top of the ministry. It is incredibly hard to have a healthy ministry without a healthy board. I would argue that the vast majority of Christian parachurch ministry boards are unhealthy, and that the ministries suffer because of this. Probably some of you have been involved with ministries that aren't doing well, and the board's either not engaged or they're not doing a good job. One of the reasons I know this is a problem is just because of my own personal experience. I'm on 3 boards currently. I've been on 3 boards previous, and I work with a lot of different Christian ministries, and I get to see the inner workings of them. And so I've started to notice some trends and some patterns, and unfortunately, most of the context of which I've been exposed to it is with ministries going out of ministry, exiting the ministry, which is largely a failure of the board. And I think we all want to see Christian ministries continue. So what can we do to strengthen the boards and to make sure that these ministries do well and they succeed? Because at any level, even if you're just a participant in the ministry, whether you're on the board of a ministry, whether you support it, you need to know these things because it'll also help you be aware of signs of a healthy ministry board and an unhealthy ministry board. But it's like a lot of things, until you really get involved with it, you don't know what it's like. Do you know of any ministries that have failed? And by failed, I mean collapsed or gone out of business or had a takeover. Might be able to think of a few. I think of it as being very tragic and unnecessary. And I would say 99% of the time, that's because of the board, right? It all goes back to the leadership. Who's in charge? If you don't take the time to learn what a healthy board looks like, then you're unlikely to, 1, be a healthy influence on a board, and 2, identify an unhealthy board. So first, I want to start with the essentials, board responsibilities. So what do board members do? What are they responsible for? Well, one of the books that I read is called the Nonprofit Board Answer Book, written by the Board Source. And it was really well done, and it had 10 key responsibilities. None of these are controversial at all. 10 duties of a board. First one is vision statement, mission statement, core values, mission drift. And have you guys worked on a vision statement before, a mission statement? It's your purpose. What is it you want to do? What is it you want to accomplish with the ministry? And you can take notes, but I did print out some handouts of this, so I can give you a handout afterwards if you're interested, so you don't have to write everything down if you don't want to. But that's the first thing, is the board's responsible for vision statements and mission statements, core values, and preventing mission drift, maybe the most important one. The second one is they select the CEO or the president or the director. Third, they support and review the CEO. So the CEO is going to need help. He's going to need encouragement, direction, and advice, so they do that. But they also review them, just like any employee gets a review, and the board reviews that person. They ensure effective planning. They're looking at the big picture. Are we doing a good job planning? Number 5, they monitor and strengthen programs and services. 6, they ensure adequate finances. You've probably seen ministries go out of business because they don't have enough money. They don't have enough support. Well, boards are responsible to making sure that they have that support. Staff should be focusing on programs and their mission unless they're hired for fundraising. Number 7, they protect assets and provide financial oversight. Specifically, they review and approve budgets. So generally, the ministry will provide the budget, and then the board reviews it and approves it or gives suggestions or feedback. Number 8, the board's responsible for building a competent board. They have to bring in other board members. 9, this is an important one here in California, ensure legal and ethical integrity. You don't want to be violating the laws. It gives California a reason to shut you down. But you also want to be ethical because, as we know, especially living in California, all laws are not ethical. So we don't just want to follow the laws. We want to have God's morality and ethics. And then 10, the last one is enhance the organization's public standing, right? You want to be a good ambassador for the organization, just like you do want to be a good ambassador for the Lord as well. So those are the essentials, the 10 essentials that board members do. Now I'm going to run through real quick good ideas. I have a list of good ideas. Not essential, but here's some good ideas if you're on a board. Adopt board member expectations. So think about this. Let's say I come to you and I say, hey, I want you to be on the board of AIM. Your first question should be, what does that mean? What do you want me to do? You can kind of guess what it means, but isn't it good to have a list of these are our expectations? Without a list of expectations, there's misunderstandings, miscommunications, and frustration. So good to adopt board member expectations. And I printed out in the printout an example of board expectations so that you could, if you ever wanted to reference that or get some ideas, there's a list there. On boards, when you're reviewing financials, a lot of times the boards will send the financials the night before. You don't really get a chance to review it. Good idea to send it a week early. Mission and vision statement. So if everything the board does is around the mission and vision statement, it's a good idea to put that on the agenda so that you can always look at that agenda and say, we have a difficult question we're working through. We need to think about what the answer is. Are we looking through the vision of the mission statement? And if you have that handy, you will always remember, this is our purpose. What are we here for? And it helps you to answer questions. Submitting discussions items before the day of the board, not at the board meeting. That's just part of being organized. Clarify what the board's responsible and not responsible for. So sometimes maybe a question will come up about hiring. Well, the board's not responsible for hiring outside of the CEO. The CEO is responsible for hiring. So making sure that you're clear on what the board's deciding on and not deciding on. Before adding board members, ask tough questions. I mean, you should do this when you hire people. You should do this when people date your children. You should do this when you go to a new church. You should ask tough questions, right? And don't just interview them once, interview them multiple times. You always get different feedback every time you talk to someone a second time, and you get a different impression than you would have the first time. Fill out applications. What makes you qualified for the board? What experience do you have? It's just a good way to find out more information about people. And it's also good to have them sit in on meetings. When they sit in the meetings, they can get an idea of what your board's about. Bylaws, super boring, but necessary. An interesting thing, a lot of Christian ministries struggle because they don't have up-to-date bylaws and they get sued and they get problems because of that. But did you know that there is a free service that tells you how to do your bylaws in a legal way that allows you to say, we support natural, God-given marriage. We are against abortion. We can have all these things in our bylaws, and there's a legal way to do that. But so many ministries miss out on that because they don't take advantage of it. And there's a free service from Alliance Defending Freedom that tells you how to do your bylaws and structure them the right way. Such an important thing. Don't have your ministry go out of business because you didn't take the time to look and make sure you have your bylaws right. I know bylaws sounds boring, but it's all critical. It's the back end stuff that makes ministries happen that's so important. Create committees. Committees can work on specific issues so that the board's not working on a ton of stuff. If you have a short-term project, let's say you're doing a new building, or you've got a particular legal issue, create a subcommittee, and that subcommittee can look over those issues and really dive into it, and the board doesn't get stuck doing that. Diversity. Diversity is good on boards. But when I say diversity, that's kind of a buzzword now, right? You hear diversity and you think, oh, that's like woke diversity, right? You got to have, the exact amount of these people represented and these people. And just because you have them, that's good. No, I don't mean that. I mean real diversity. So you might have noticed this, but if you have all men on your board, you're generally missing out. Women tend to look at things from a different point of view. It's good to have women on your board. If your board is made up of people who are all in their 60s and 70s, not great. You should probably have some younger people in there, people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, so that you have that age perspective that gives you a different perspective on how to do things. Really important, right? People who come from different ethnicities, different cultures can give you different value. So diversity, but not woke diversity, diversity that is actual helpful and practical. I think that's very important under the good ideas section. Have any of you guys heard of a SWOT analysis? SWOT. It stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. You should do that. Have a SWOT analysis. What are the strengths of our board? What are the weaknesses and really of the ministry? What are our opportunities to do more? What are the threats, like the bylaws, right? The legal stuff, that's a threat if you don't have that stuff in order. Staff board retreat. This is a good idea for staff and board to get to know each other better. Rough Acres is a great place to do that. There's been several staff board retreats up here. Here's an interesting one that this creeps over into a lot of other places in life. How do you make decisions? Is it majority? Is it consensus? Is it unanimity? So bonus question here, if anybody can tell me the answer to this question. What is the difference between majority and consensus? Or unanimity and consensus? What is the difference between unanimity and consensus? This is new. I just learned this. I didn't know it. Anybody want to take a stab at it?
I think consensus would be just everyone saying they agree, like being like, okay, we'll do that. Unity would be like all actually believing and behind the idea.
That's exactly it. So unanimity means everybody bought into it. Consensus means we've all signed off on it and we're willing to live with it. We don't all necessarily love it. Very important distinction. So how do you make decisions? Well, I would recommend consensus or majority. Unanimity sounds great and wonderful. Not sure it's real practical. If you're going to amend your bylaws, which is really changing the ministry, you really should probably have a super majority. And I say that because of mission drift. Mission drift is probably the number one threat to Christian ministry. Mission drift is we start out, I'll give you some good examples of mission drift. YMCA, Salvation Army, Harvard, Yale. What did those all start out as? Legitimate Christian parachurch organizations and ministries. What are they now? Not that. Why? Mission drift. We started out with this mission, but we drifted, and now we have this mission. So whenever the bylaws, someone's proposing to change that, that should probably be a supermajority to protect against mission drift. Board minutes, again, boring, I know, but when you're taking board minutes, be concise but not overly detailed. That's more of a legal problem, especially in California, where things are always used against you. You want to be concise but not overly detailed. And then lastly, a good idea, it's always good to provide food and snacks. Everybody loves to eat at a board meeting. Okay, the next category is considerations and variables. What are the things that are just options? Not necessarily good ideas, but just options. First one's term limits. You want to decide, do we want to have term limits, or do we just let people on and stay as long as they want to be on there? And do we want to have those term limits coterminous, or do we want people to term out at different times? 3 out of 5 boards have term limits. So it's more popular than not. Term limits gives people a chance to cycle off. A lot of times, especially Christians, we have a hard time saying, I don't really want to be on the board anymore. It looks like you're quitting or you're giving up. And sometimes you just need a break or you need to do another board. Term limits just makes that really easy to cycle off. Is the director going to be a voting board member? That's a big question. Some ministries, the director doesn't get to vote. Some they do. That's a good question to ask yourself. Quantity of members. Do you want a board of 3 people, which is the legal minimum, or do you want a board of 30 people, which some nonprofits actually have that many board members? But thinking, how many do you want? One thing you really don't want to do is have an even number. I am working with a board right now that I'm not on, but I'm working with this board. They are electing a new director. There is 10 board members. They had an election 2 weeks ago. Guess what the vote was? So now they're having a revote. Frequency of meetings. How often are you going to meet? For a ministry that runs really, really well, you can just meet annually. Annually is the minimum by law that you have to meet. The average is 7.4 times a year. If your ministry is struggling and not doing well, you cannot meet often enough. Once a month is really good if the ministry is struggling or if it's new. Meet all the time. You can have a local board or a national board. Most of the boards I've been on are just local. There's one that I'm on right now where we've got board members from all over the country. And so we actually have meetings all over the country. But that's an important thing to consider. What's the location of the board meeting? Are you having it in an office? Are you having it at someone's house? Are you having it at the ministry location? That's important. If you have it at the ministry location, you get to observe staff and ministry and see how that's going. Are you open to guest sitting in? Are you open to staff attending? Have you guys heard of Robert's Rules of Order? It's a way of running a board meeting where you have these pretty strict orders and procedures that you go through. Do you want to adopt that or not? And then lastly, board insurance, which is interesting because board insurance covers willful and reckless misconduct. So do you want to have insurance? I don't know. I guess it depends if you're going to engage in willful and reckless misconduct, or do you live in California and that's a wise idea? Hard to know. Okay, now we're going to get to my favorite part, pitfalls. And I wish that I could say that I came up with these myself, but unfortunately I observed, I think, all of them. So here's first pitfall: let the donors drive the mission. Big mistake. Just because someone's giving you money, don't let them determine what your ministry is about and what you're going to do. And donors will push to do that. Letting someone on your board because they're a big donor. Big mistake. Big difference between donor and board member. Another book that I read on boards is called The Redemptive Nonprofit, and it's written by Praxis Partners. And they have an idea that I really like called the stakeholder gap. And it's one of the problems that boards deal with and make a mistake on. And that is, and I'm going to read a quote from them. Often the nonprofit funders do not require its services, and those who receive its services are not its primary funders. So it's saying the people that fund the ministry aren't generally receiving the benefits of the ministry, and those who are receiving the benefits of the ministry are not funding the ministry. That's very different than a business relationship. In a business relationship, the people who are putting the money in are receiving the benefits, and those who are buying the products are receiving the products. It kind of keeps it in check. If you create products people don't want, they don't buy them. But we have this stakeholder gap in nonprofits where that doesn't line up the same way. So how do you address that issue? And that's complex, but just wanted to share that. Having ministry debt. Have any of you guys done Financial Peace University or listened to Dave Ramsey? Okay. I I'm going to be very forward on this and very direct. Ministry debt is bad. It's a bad thing 99% of the time. It's not like debt is bad for you personally, but good for your ministry. It's not. Debt usually comes from laziness, from people who don't want to fundraise, who don't want to save and be disciplined, who want to go the easy way out. And I will say that unabashedly, during COVID, do you know how many Christian camps went out of business because of debt? Dozens and dozens just in California because of the debt, because of what Scripture says about debt. So debt is a very bad idea. Related to that, do you guys know what an endowment is? It's different than a scholarship, different than a bursary, different than many other things. Do you know what an endowment is? Yep, but it's more than that. An endowment would be where, I can give you an example for you San Diego people. Are you familiar with the Kroc Center just outside of La Mesa in San Diego? That has a $100 million endowment. So Joan Kroc, who was the McDonald's, the wife of the McDonald's, Ray Kroc, she gave an endowment of $100 million. So what she did is she put $100 million in an investment pool, and all the money generated from that $100 million goes to run the Kroc Center. So that sounds great. I mean, wouldn't you like your ministry to have an endowment with just money that just keeps coming in endlessly no matter what? Of course you would, but it's a big pitfall. So what happens to a ministry who goes, maybe they go super liberal and now, they don't value Christian values anymore? What happens to them? Well, normally they would go out of business and that would be a good thing. But with an endowment, they'll never go out of business. They'll last forever because they've got that funding. So having to have supporters and raise support, yeah, it's a pain, but guess what? It keeps you on the right path. It keeps you accountable. And that's the biggest thing about ministry and being on boards is accountable. Nobody's above accountability. Nobody's the Pope. Nobody's Jesus. None of us are above accountability. That's what a board is. A board is accountability. An endowment takes away financial accountability. Rubber stamping. So this is where I get to this part of it. What you see most commonly in boards is a board that is just cheerleading, and they're rubber stamping everything that the director says. When I was in college, I did a 4-month internship as a youth pastor for a small community church about an hour away from here. And it was such a good experience for me, but I got to sit in my first meeting ever, my first board meeting ever, and it was a church meeting. There was 3 elders there and the senior pastor. And it was so interesting because the senior pastor said, I think we should do vacation Bible school this summer. And so one of the elders said, I motion we do vacation Bible school. And everybody agreed and it passed. And then the senior pastor said, I think we should do a special fundraiser and car wash in 3 weeks. And the same thing, elder made the motion, it all passed. And by the end of the meeting, I realized the elders weren't doing anything but exactly what the senior pastor told them to do. And so that was my first taste of realizing there wasn't any accountability there. It was just do whatever you're told to do. Don't challenge anything, just rubber stamp it. And you see a lot of this in boards, and it's very unhealthy because you get runaway directors that do whatever they think God's telling them to do or whatever they want to do. And none of us are made for no accountability. And cheerleading is very close to that. It's the same thing. It's where you get people come in and they're just encouraging. They just want to encourage. I'm an encourager and I just want to encourage you. And sometimes those people have a hard time challenging people. And so they're always telling the director how great they are. Well, what would happen to you if you had a lot of people telling you how great you were all the time? You think you might get some pride and start thinking, yeah, God really is using me. I am doing a little bit more than the rest of them. I've kind of got a little bit of a special gift, a little bit more than the other guys. So you have to be careful. You want to be encouraging. That's very important. But there has to be accountability in there as well. So there's got to be a balance. And that's what we see missing on a lot of boards. The opposite side of that is, if you've ever been around an argumentative person, you don't just argue for the sake of arguing. You don't need someone on the board who just has to create problems and argue just because they want to argue. That is a big pitfall. You don't need people doing that. Rubber stamping and cheerleading are the number one reasons for failed ministries that I have heard about or observed. You could also interpret that as a weak board, people who are afraid to challenge people to be accountable. The last pitfall that I will share No, it's not the last. Last on this page. This big pitfall is the micromanager. Boards are not micromanagers. They're not supposed to be into the details. Boards are big picture. So you want to make sure that you don't have a micromanager there. Don't be afraid of conflict. Healthy conflict. Have you guys heard that term, healthy conflict? It's the kind of conflict you're supposed to have. My brother-in-law is on a board, and that board is so afraid of healthy conflict that they take most of their votes in secret through email. And you're just thinking, this is crazy. Like, you're so afraid that somebody might be offended of what you say or you believe that we're going to do secret voting. Really bad idea. Here's another pitfall that was also a good idea. Diversity. Diversity for just being diverse, but for no real reason. And let me tell you the pitfall of that. Did you know that California recently passed a law called SB 826 that required every corporation in California to have a woman on the board? So that just got passed a couple years ago. I'll tell you why that's a pitfall. Let's say you come into a board and there's 9 men in there and 1 woman. What is your thought going to be on the 1 woman that's there? She's just meeting a quota. She's not qualified to be here. She doesn't have anything to offer. She's just meeting a quota. What a sad thing that is. That is a terrible way to run a board and to have people where other people are questioning, are you a legitimate member because you're just meeting quotas or you're just trying to be diverse for diversity's sake? Two more pitfalls. One, not asking questions when you don't understand. This is a good life thing just in general. You're in a meeting, people are talking about something, you're looking around, you're like, am I the only one who doesn't understand this? But you don't want to say, I don't understand, because then you look dumb. But be humble and ask questions. People actually respect that. People respect you when you say, I don't know what that means, because you guys explained that to me. Be humble and ask questions when you don't understand. Last thing, when you're on a board and you lose a vote, if it's consensus, especially, you need to publicly say, I'm supporting this and I'm good with this, and not be undermining the board by saying you don't support this. Now, if the board passes something that is a deal breaker, then you should step off the board. All right, the next section is types of board members. So I had a little bit of fun with this, but I'm going to go through just some different people names and some stereotypes of people that I've run into in boards, but you've probably run into them in your life as well. First one is LinkedIn Leslie. I met this fellow at a board meeting, and he told me, and I'm not exaggerating, he was on 42 boards. And then he proceeded to tell me about his business. Why do you think LinkedIn Leslie was on these boards? To promote his business. Want to avoid that. Dinosaur Dawn. This member has been on the board for 40 years. They feel like it's a lifetime commitment. They're usually not engaged 40 years in. It's hard to be pretty engaged for 40 years on something like that, and they're just going through the motions. Often they're just too afraid to quit and step down. But sometimes Dinosaur Dawn is the most valuable board member as well, because they have 40 years of history on the board. Passive or pastoral Pat. This one's painful. Always afraid to say anything that might not be loving. Heaven forbid we disagree on anything. Peacemaker Pat will always do their best to keep everything perceived as being harmonious, as though healthy conflict does not exist. I love pastoral people, but unfortunately they rarely make good board members because they are deathly afraid of healthy conflict. They don't want people disagreeing. They want everybody happy. Generally do not make good board members. Silent Shannon. I know Shannon's on the board, but they never say anything. So I usually forget they're even here. Shannon doesn't cause any problems, but I'm not sure if they have any opinions or they're just being painfully polite. Sometimes this is because of cultural reasons, and then you just need to draw them out and engage them and specifically ask them for their opinions on things. And other times it's because someone's a new board member and they don't want to dominate when they're the new guy. They want to listen. That's a very healthy thing to have, that a new board member sits and learns and is junior and then shares more as they get more comfortable and have been there a longer time and they understand things better. Okay, the opposite of Silent Shannon, Loudmouth Lee. You guys all know a Loudmouth Lee. Lee never knows when to shut up. Lee has an opinion on everything. Lee talks half the meeting. Everyone wishes Lee would leave. A good chair knows when to ask Lee to pipe down and when to ask Shannon to pipe up. Non-contributing Casey. Now, Casey does not contribute anything. Casey talks plenty, but has nothing of value to contribute. Sat on a board with a few of these guys. You just wonder, how did they get on the board? Prideful Peyton. Easily confused for Silent Shannon. Only on the board for recognition. Prideful Peyton doesn't say anything either because they're there for the wrong reasons. Don't mistake their silence for shyness. They don't care about their ministry, just about their recognition. These people love to jump on a ministry, and when a ministry really takes off and starts doing well. Dreamer Devin. Devin has grandiose visions and ideas for the board. Although most of the time this can be unproductive because they're unrealistic, it's occasionally genius. Sometimes this person conflicts with the director's vision, and that needs to be handled carefully. All right, this next one I named after myself. It's Timely Thiessen. My last name is Thiessen. So when I first got on boards, I get a lot of anxiety when things go too long. It's supposed to be an hour session. It's going 2 hours, and I start to get really upset, and I just need to cool down. So I had to reframe. Have you heard that expression before? Reframing your thinking and look at things from a different perspective. And now when I sit in a board meeting, I just go in with the attitude that this is going to take a long time. We're going to be off topic most of the time, and I'm okay with that. And honestly, that has changed things to where now I'm not the difficult guy who's getting upset with everybody trying to get through it. I'm just relaxed and letting things play out. Flaky Francis. You guys have a flaky Francis in your life for sure. Francis has a really good heart, but is perpetually busy and rarely, if ever, follows through on service outside of the board meeting. They're also typically late for the board meeting, or they just don't show up. Not always a bad person, just not the right person for a board. Manipulative Morgan. Morgan tries to represent the board when it's not appropriate. These are people who go outside the board. They'll meet with staff and say, the board has said this. Come on, Morgan, the board didn't say that. Don't try to manipulate your way out of things. And they try to be all things to all people, and it's always unclear what they really believe. Last one is Big Donor Blair. Blair is only on the board because they donate a lot of money. They don't really offer anything, and someone should have told them no when they wanted to get on the board. All right. Ideal board member characteristics. Likes the idea of healthy conflict. Able to be less talkative when they are new to the board. Passionate about the ministry. You got to have people on your board that are passionate. Not afraid to make a potentially stupid suggestion. This falls into the humility thing. You've got a dumb idea, just share it. You never know, it might be better than you think. Not afraid to be bold when everyone else seems to think differently. I've had this several times at a board where somebody says something and 3 or 4 other people say, yeah, it's a great idea. And I'm thinking, this is the worst idea ever. And there's this thing inside of you that's like, don't say anything, just be quiet. You're wrong, everybody else is right. And some of the times when you pipe up and say, actually, I think I disagree with that, some of the times people turn around like, you're right. So thankful you said something because we were headed down this wrong direction and you said something. And other times you're wrong. Someone who's not afraid to challenge the CEO. Someone who's willing to ask other board members to step off the board. Someone who's excited to get involved and help out. So important. Someone who's humble. You have to be humble as a Christian, and you have to be extra humble to be on a board. Someone who knows when to talk and knows when to be quiet. Then I have some scripture, and I'll just read through this real quick, and you can grab an example later of some things. But one, seeking wise counsel. That's what a board is all about. A board is all about seeking wise counsel. Proverbs 11:14. These are all Proverbs. 12:15, 13:10, 15:22, 19:20, 24:6. Why is it mentioned that many times? because it's so important. It's so critical in life to seek wise counsel. Your board should be that wise counsel. Open to rebuke. Proverbs 9:7-8, 13:18, 15:31, 25:12, 27:5, 28:23, and 2 Timothy 4:2. You have to be open to rebuke. And that's not just sin. It's also just, there's a lot of gray areas in ministry when you're making decisions on boards, right? Let's say you have to pick a new building and there's two options. Does God have this overwhelming clear view of which building you should be in? I would say that's probably a gray area. So when you disagree on that, you have to be open to not getting your way and realizing that's not a sin issue. It's a preference issue. But maybe there's some things about that one building that's better than the others, and you're not realizing that. You just have to be open to rebuke. That all comes in with humility. Having debt obviously is a big picture thing where there's lots of reasons in scripture when you put it all together that show that. But some of the specific ones, Proverbs 22:7, Romans 13:8, Luke 14:28, Proverbs 22:26-27, and Matthew 6:24. Healthy conflict is also more of a big picture example that you see in scripture. We see that with the apostles, where some of them go this way and some of them go that way, but they're not parting necessarily on bad terms. Matthew 5:38, Matthew 18:15, Hebrews 12:15, Ephesians 4:15, Proverbs 27:6. And then lastly, plurality of elders. This is really the model of which a board comes from, which is it's the non-king model. We don't have a king who makes all the decisions, but we have a plurality of elders, a plurality of leaders who all contribute. If you're a Catholic board, this may not apply because in the Catholic system, there is a very big hierarchy, and that probably wouldn't apply. But the big thing is the CEO shouldn't be making all the decisions. Your board members are not fundraisers. They're an accountability board that makes sure you're headed on the right track. We need that. We all need that in our life. We all need accountability in our life. But sometimes with churches and with boards, we think God gave a pastor or a director a special word or a special calling, and that they're immune from accountability. And that's not biblical. That's not the case. So I hope that was mildly interesting for you guys. I am really passionate about ministry. I want to see ministries succeed. I want to see your ministry succeed. It needs to happen with a healthy board. And unfortunately, there's not enough tough love on healthy boards, and there's a lack of healthy conflict, and a little bit too much cheerleading. So we want to be able to argue and talk about things and do it in a healthy way. So that's what I have. So I wanted to open it up and see if you guys had any questions or any challenges or any thoughts on what I said.
Well, we have a board of 5 at Thousand Rainbows, and so my wife and I are on the board, sort of vested interest. That's not really the point, but the idea is what I've found in different board iterations, our donors are actually some of the most committed to the vision.
Yeah.
Now, I don't want to empower somebody who's going to be power hungry to be like making big decisions or pushing an agenda or something that's not like holistic of the vision and purpose. But at the same time, I find that that's a good pull from, I've found very good success in our team. And I think there's been a little bit like for me, I have to like sometimes say, as you're hiring, here's some things, maybe can you create some things around my positions that will make accountable to it. So there's a little bit of just a little bit of complications in it that could be potentially obvious, but for one, how do you gauge a good committed board member that's maybe potential that's not in your midst yet?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wrote that down. I'm going to add that to good ideas. Just like, it's a good idea and a pitfall to have diversity. I think it's a good idea and a pitfall to hire from your donor base. On one of the boards that I'm on, our newest board member is a big donor. And this guy's been committed. The stuff that he has done for the ministry and the personal things he's done and putting everybody else ahead of him is like, we were so excited to bring him on the board because he is so committed. And I think it's similar to appointing elders and deacons in your church. You don't appoint someone and then say, okay, now you do the ministry. They need to already be doing the ministry. So a lot of times a good board member is somebody who's already involved. Those are your best people. You know that they're passionate. So I think that's a great point, that you can hire from your donor base and you'll get some of your best board members there.
I mean, it's like our donors, they don't get paid, they pay.
Yeah.
And they're actually volunteering
Yes.
and as that way as leaders. And, you know, they're kind of actually sometimes volunteering other ways too. But do you have any other wisdom around like, you know, volunteers in your midst? Is that a good pool to pull from? Just depends on the person. It's more like, I'm interested in younger generation as well, like allowing for younger seeded generational people instead of just like kind of, we have a little bit of variety in there actually, but kind of, to me, it's like wisdom comes with those gray hairs, you know, people want to say. So, you know, I'm just wondering, you know, some of the volunteers, did you meet them? What's some kind of things to look at in terms of like adding this younger generation?
Yeah, I think for volunteers, that's a great place to pull people from as well. And I really like the idea of adding younger generations. I was really blessed to get on my first couple of boards in my early 30s, and I was the young guy on there because there's rarely people on boards under 40, let alone, you know, in their 30s or 20s. And so that gave me a good advantage to really learn and sit back and learn what is it like to be on a board. And I was so thankful for that opportunity. And I probably, in some ways, I offered different things, like a different perspective, but I certainly didn't have the wisdom that comes with people who've done things for a long time, and just older people in general, or, you know, good Christian men and women have a lot of wisdom. And so you don't get that same amount of history and wisdom with a younger person, but I think the idea is we need to be bringing young people up in our churches and in our ministries and getting them engaged and still seeing that they have value. I mean, Timothy says that. Don't let people look down on you because you're young. Be an example. So I just think it's really important to have that diversity of age on boards.
Do you have, like, you said, like, the legal minimum is like 3 board members, and you can go all the way up there. Since some organizations are like 30 or more. Do you have any sort of, in your experience, consent, or like what is the ideal number? I mean, I know you said odd is important, but
Yeah.
if you had to pick a number of people you would want on the board, where would you go?
Yeah, that's a good question. In terms of how many people is ideal for a board, I think it's different for every ministry. I've always been more of a small board guy because it's a little more efficient, maybe a little more timely. And it felt like you get stuff done a little bit better. But as I've been reading and studying about boards, I realized that that's maybe not the best idea. If you can get more people on a board, that's better. And it's just better to have subcommittees. So it's always good to have a lawyer on your board, or someone with an accounting background, or somebody who's a pastor, somebody who has very specific knowledge and skill set. But once they're being dumped into, you know, like bringing the pastor into the financial conversation is usually not great. Bringing the lawyer into the ministry pastoral components usually not great. So having subcommittees that work on stuff like a finance committee or different committees, I think that's really helpful. And if you can build a bigger board, that's better, but you have to establish subcommittees. So I think that's something that I've learned recently, and I probably want to do a better job of building up some of the boards that I'm on to have more people and just run it in a more effective way. But I think it depends on the ministry too. I think it really depends. A very healthy ministry probably needs a little bit less. A struggling ministry definitely needs more. So that would be my feedback on that.
So what if you're on board and as a general culture, the board is sort of passive and the leader of the ministry is sort of dominant? How do you change that culture?
Yeah, that is the typical board makeup, is to have a dominant CEO and a passive board. The dominant CEOs prefer to put on the board people that will be yes men, and changing that is very hard to do. I wish I had a good answer for that. I think just being an example is good. Maybe talking to other board members and encouraging them to challenge other people. And then when accepting new board members on, really looking for people who will challenge the status quo and are willing to engage in healthy conflict. Wish I had a better answer than that.
Two
two things. One, I was just gonna say, we kind of had that a little bit with our board. And we, not that this is the answer for everything or whatever, but in our situation, I know we just started like mentioning, making that a point of discussion of like, please question us, please like critically evaluate, like, if we all get yeses every time, we're gonna start being like, I reject that. And our board responded immediately, and they started asking more critical questions, which we really appreciated. So, just offering our experience for whatever. That's right.
Yeah, that's great. You know, the idea of if you're if you're a director of a board or a CEO, asking your board to challenge you. Hey guys, challenge me on this. You know, ask me tough questions. Give me some feedback. That's great input. Yeah, nice when they actually do it. Yeah.
A question just about our board is still fairly small, so at some point I'd like to grow. We're a fairly small ministry right now, but thinking about like who's an ideal person, those committed people we have are students, but it's youth. So they're not. I think they're too young to be board members, and we've typically drawn the line where we haven't had. So I feel like, I guess, then we've been drawing from people who are like supportive, but they're not necessarily the most passionate about our ministry. They're just like, yeah, I think it's great, you know, and that's okay. They've definitely been a great support. Our next biggest, most committed people are the parents of our youth. And there's been a lot of debate whether that's a good idea or a bad idea. Some ministries, the majority of their board is parents and the team members. In our case, that we have not permitted parents to be on the board. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Wow, that's good.
Have current, well, we had one as a treasurer, she was a current, but past parents make excellent board members because they're very familiar with what goes on and they don't have current kids.
Yeah, that was a good answer. Bringing on past parents. I think current parents is kind of like big donors. It could be good, but it could be bad. They're definitely going to have a vested interest and be more passionate about it. Certainly tapping your alumni base. What a great idea. Those are people who are really going to be supportive and who will really understand the ministry, which is important. I'm not a big fan of having people on boards that they're really smart or they're really successful, but they don't really understand, nor are they passionate about the ministry. I'm not sure that's great. Sometimes it's good, like I said, having a lawyer on there who can really help you keep out of trouble and give you practical stuff is good, but you don't want that to be the majority of your board, I don't think.
So I'm from Thiessen, Pennsylvania, and I'm not like in any position that would need to interact with the board at all. What should my understanding or relationship to the board be? Like, I'm not a director on a team, and the directors would have more conversations with the board, but like they're not part of the board either. So like, yeah, what would that look like?
Are you staff? Yeah. So a red flag of an unhealthy CEO or director is when the CEO or director forbids the staff from talking to the board. Now you're going to say, Brendan, that doesn't happen. I can tell you that the two closest ministries to this facility have both done that, where they have banned staff from talking to the board. That is a huge red flag. Because what are you doing? You're trying to manipulate and control. Staff should be meeting the board, and the board should be hearing from staff. They should be having appropriate conversations and not overstepping their bounds with the CEO. But it's very important that the staff is engaged with the board and that they can have conversations. So I don't know that there's much you can do in your position to engage with staff, with the board, but you could certainly ask if you would be able to sit in a meeting or part of a board meeting. That's good to do. I encourage board members to invite staff to come in and sit on their meetings, and not for all of it, because there's always going to be stuff that's not appropriate to hear, but just for them to see how does the board operate? What are they talking about? You know, I found that like with my church, when I've occasionally sat in on an elders or deacons meeting, I've been really encouraged where I've thought, oh, I wish they would work on this. And then I sit in there and wow, they are working on this and they are aware of this. So I know it's very encouraging to people when they attend a church or when they're on a board, so, or staff. on a ministry.
So you're on a board, an organization or a ministry, and someone who's 18 to 25, say, wants to join the board. They have experience with ministry and other things. Like, what are things you look for in someone like that?
Yeah, I think that's really good and healthy. I think most boards are probably not going to be super excited about that. So once you get on a board, you have to be the one saying, we got to get young people on here. I think the best thing you can always do, just like at your church, you want to be an elder or deacon at your church, serve, really serve, be an example, get in there, do it, and show, ask them, how can I help? Let me know how I can be a part of this. I think that's the best way, is just get involved. All right, well, we are 5 minutes past our time, so I don't want to, got to be timely, Thiessen. I don't mind answering the questions at all, but I don't know what's next on your agenda, so I don't want to go dinner. Okay.
So I know some of us, we've got small ministries or newly started ministries. Like, when's the right time to start a board? Because obviously if you're brand new and you've got very few kids involved in your ministry, it may feel weird to have a board that's the same size as your ministry. But at the same time, at some point, clearly that becomes a necessity for accountability and stuff like that. I don't know, are there some good guidelines of if you're doing certain sort of things when you should start looking at getting board?
I would start it right away. I can't think of any reason why you wouldn't. I think especially because in the initial steps, that's where the key formation happens. Your mission statement, your vision statement, your core values, that's all formed from the beginning, the first people you ask on the board. So I think that's a pretty critical time. And if you get the right people, they can really, really help you. So I would think sooner than later, but I'm open to any reasons why not.
But you also if you fundraise in 501c3, then you got to have a board.
You have to.
So
Yes.
even if you're small, you have to have one.
That is true.
I just want to say something for those with the small ministries, and I just remembered that we used to, so I'm a reminder to us, we used to have some of our student leaders, a student leader representative, come to each board member, meeting, and take turns doing that. First of all, to represent the students and to the board, so that they could hear from them from the students' perspective, and then also so that they can learn and see what's going on. We need to do that. Remind me. I know. We need to do it.
What I was wondering about is how much say should board members have in who a new board member would be, or what does that look like for bringing in new board members?
Yeah, so typically what would happen is you'd be replacing a board member. So when you replace a board member, how do you decide on who the new one is? Is that your question?
We thought about expanding our board because we do have a small board. If you want to add people to your board, what does that look like?
Yeah, so if you want to add people to your board or replace someone on your board, then usually what happens is you talk about that at the board meeting and you come up with some ideas of people who that have recommendations. If you can't come up with anybody, you can talk to staff or donors and kind of just reach out and see who's interested. Again, you'd want to board member expectations so that it's very clear this is what you would be participating in and what your expectations are to serve on there. And so it really is networking. So if you go back to our first character, LinkedIn Leslie can help you find the right guy because he knows everybody or she knows everybody.
But that is usually something that would be done as a board versus the CEO saying, I want to bring this person in.
Yeah, it should be done by the board, but the CEO should also be contributing. But most CEOs will really try to control who comes on. So, you got to be careful. But if the CEO is part of the board, then it makes even more sense to have the whole board do it because the CEO is still getting a say in it.
What are your thoughts on, in my school, they have a board, and the head of the board and director, whatever, head of director, whatever it is, you know.
Yeah, chair of the
Yeah, chair of the board.
Yeah.
Circulates around once a year, so this during the school year. What are your thoughts on that kind of system?
Yeah, I think that's really good. I didn't get into it, but I do have written in the notes the obligations. Like, what's the difference between a chair and just a regular board member? And the chair is supposed to keep the board on track during meetings. They make sure everyone's participating. So if someone's quiet, like Silent Shannon, you're trying to reach out and get them to talk. They need to be organized. They need to be bold. But their duties are, one, run meetings. The chair runs the board meetings. Co-author the agenda. So the chair of the board and the director will co-author the agenda together. The chair also has key relationships. So key relationships with donors, with staff, with other people that are important. And the chair is also supposed to support the CEO. So they'll generally meet with that. And I'm using CEO, director, president, all interchangeably, but they should be meeting regularly with the CEO and just kind of hammering stuff out on a one-to-one basis. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate your questions. And I've got some copies of the notes, and I'll just leave them up here on the chair, so feel free to grab a copy.